Hello, dear listeners of Z Sci-Fi Stories, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep our operations running. If you find yourself enjoying today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hard-working team to cover their living expenses and continue creating these sci-fi adventures for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the PayPal link down in the description or the pinned comment. They laughed while the alien girl starved. A chunk of rust-stained ice shattered against her crystalline shoulder, drawing another roar of ugly laughter from the rough men huddled by the roaring industrial heaters. She did not flinch, and she did not speak. At the desolate edge of HFY, she was dying, cracking apart piece by beautiful piece, right in front of the very creatures she refused to beg for salvation. HFY was a world that actively hated life. It was a frozen hellscape of jagged glaciers and toxic frost, a place where the ambient temperature sat permanently at levels that could flash freeze human lungs in a matter of seconds. Yet, humanity had clawed its way into the ice anyway, driven by the relentless hunger for quantum ore. The mining outpost was an ugly scar of gray metal and blinking hazard lights against the pristine, deadly white of the planet. It was a place of deafening noise. The heavy, rhythmic thud of tectonic pounders shook the bedrock. Hydraulic drills shrieked against subterranean permafrost, and massive atmospheric scrubbers roared like caged beasts. But just outside the flickering boundary of the settlement's thermal shields, there was only the dead, suffocating silence of the void. And in that silence stood Zelia. She was not flesh and bone. Zelia was a breathtaking entity, composed entirely of living silicon and bioluminescent crystal. In her prime, her body had pulsed with the radiant, shifting colors of a nebula, singing in perfect harmony with the melody network, the vast, telepathic hive mind of her people. Now, she was severed from that song. A profound, agonizing emptiness had taken its place, standing perfectly motionless, just beyond the reach of the human perimeter. She looked like an exquisite statue carved from amethyst and frost. But Zelia was not frozen. She was starving. Her species did not consume organic matter. They did not need protein or water. They fed on specific bands of thermoacoustic radiation, a complex blend of heat and harmonic frequencies that nourished their crystalline matrices. Without it, her inner light was failing. The vibrant, warm violet that usually flowed through her translucent veins had dimmed to a sickly, pale gray. Worse still, the structural integrity of her body was giving way. Minuscule, jagged fractures were beginning to spiderweb across her chest and arms, each new crack echoing in her mind like a violently snapped harp string. Less than 50 yards away, a shift of quantum ore miners was taking their break. They were a hardened, grease-stained crew, wrapped in heavy thermal suits and huddled around a towering plasma heater that blasted glorious, life-saving radiation into the freezing air. It was a feast of energy, right there, just out of Zelia's reach. One of the miners, a man with a scarred face and a grating voice, scooped up a lump of dirty ice and hurled it at her. It struck her knee, shattering into a spray of grit. "Hey, broken rock!" the miner shouted, his breath pluming in the harsh artificial lighting. "You going to stand there until the next ice age? Come over to the heater or freeze to death." Another miner chuckled, taking a swig from a thermal flask. "Leave her alone. She is just a crazy meditator. Probably thinks the cold is going to bring her enlightenment. Stupid crystal." They laughed again, a harsh, abrasive sound that clashed violently with the elegant geometry of Zelia's mind. They thought she was stubborn. They thought she was a mindless anomaly, choosing to stand in the deadly cold. The bitter, agonizing paradox was that Zelia was screaming for help. She had been crying out for days, projecting desperate, harmonic pleas toward the human camp. But the outpost was surrounded by massive atmospheric sound dampeners, heavy machines designed to cancel out the lethal, deafening roar of the planet's atmospheric storms and the ground-shattering vibrations of the drills. These dampeners flooded the area with a blanket of anti-noise, a dead zone of localized frequencies. By pure, tragic coincidence, the dampener's frequency perfectly intercepted and nullified Zilia's communication band. To the humans, she was entirely mute. Her intricate, desperate songs of starvation were swallowed by the invisible wall of human machinery before they could travel a single inch. She could not ask for the warmth of their plasma heaters. She could not explain that her body was tearing itself apart, and she refused to step into their filthy, chaotic territory uninvited. Zilia was a melody weaver. In the glorious days before her exile, she had shaped the resonant frequencies of stars, crafting symphonies of light and heat that spanned entire solar systems. She possessed a fierce, ancient pride woven into the very atomic structure of her being. Even as another chunk of ice bounced off her chest, even as a fresh, painful crack split the crystal of her forearm, she held her ground. She would not lower her head. She would not crawl into the dirt and gesture like a primitive beast just to scavenge a few scraps of ambient heat from these loud, ignorant creatures who walked on two legs. If the universe demanded that her song end here, in the dark and the cold of Aegis 9, then she would let her light fade out completely. She would shatter into a million grains of silent sand before she ever surrendered her dignity to the noise. Emmanuel Bull did not care for the laughter of men. He was a seismic blaster operator, a mountain of a man whose thick atmospheric suit was permanently caked in a stubborn, unyielding mixture of synthetic grease, deep crust rock dust, and corrosive frost. His shift had just ended after 14 grueling hours down in the pitch-black subterranean layers, placing explosive charges into fault lines that most sane geologists would not dare to even look at. He was deeply tired. His heavy bones ached with a dull, persistent throb, and his temper was as frayed as the worn cabling on his mining rig. As he trudged heavily toward the decontamination airlock, the harsh guffaws of the surface or crew scraped violently against his nerves. He turned his heavy gaze toward the source of their amusement. Emmanuel's job was not simply about blowing things up for the corporation. It required an obsessive, meticulous attention to resonance. He spent his entire life listening to the microscopic groans of tectonic plates, tuning his senses to vibrations so subtle they would never register on the cheap corporate seismographs. Because of this specialized labor, his auditory implants were highly modified, calibrated to pick up deep crust acoustic anomalies. And right now, those cybernetic implants were picking up something that the massive atmospheric dampeners were completely missing. It was a frequency, a high, desperate, thrumming resonance that vibrated through the frozen bedrock, bypassing the air entirely, and climbed straight up through the thick magnetic soles of his boots. It felt exactly like hearing a heavy steel cable being pulled tighter and tighter until it was a microsecond away from violently snapping. He looked at the alien standing just beyond the perimeter. The others just saw a shiny rock playing a stubborn game of statue. Emmanuel felt a creature bleeding out in a silent language of pure, panicked vibration. "Hey, Bull!" one of the miners called out, grinning through a frozen, filthy beard. "Watch this. I bet I can chip her shoulder piece right off." The man reached down for another jagged chunk of debris. "Drop it," Emmanuel rumbled. His voice was not loud, but it carried the heavy, undeniable density of a falling boulder. The miner paused, the ugly grin slipping quickly from his face as he met the blaster operator's hard, flat stare. The piece of ice fell harmlessly back into the snow. Emmanuel did not offer a grand lecture on morality. He simply adjusted the heavy utility belt at his waist, bypassed the roaring thermal heater where the others were comfortably clustered, and walked straight past the flashing yellow warning pylons. He stepped firmly out of the safe zone. The temperature drop was instantaneous and brutal, a physical blow that caused his suit's microheaters to whine in high-pitched protest. He ignored the flashing proximity alarms lighting up on his wrist console, dragging a discarded, frost-covered cargo crate across the jagged ground. He dropped it heavily, a mere 2 feet away from the crystalline entity, and sat down with a heavy sigh. From the deep, reinforced pouches of his belt, Emmanuel retrieved a primary charge canister. With practiced, calloused thumbs, he twisted the locking mechanism and pulled out a superheated plasma battery core. To a human, an exposed core was an active, deadly hazard. It was a dense cylinder of unstable, hyper-compressed energy that leaked raw thermal radiation. Hold it too long, and it would cook the flesh right off a man's bones, straight through his insulated gloves. But to a creature forged in the deep cosmos, starved of thermoacoustic nourishment, it was a royal banquet. Emmanuel did not look at her with pity. He despised pity. Pity was for the weak, and the creature standing beside him, holding herself together by sheer, stubborn force of will, was clearly anything but weak. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the dark, jagged horizon. With a sharp, deliberate crack, he snapped the heavy protective casing entirely off the battery. The core instantly flared a blinding, angry orange, hissing as the ambient frost violently vaporized around it. He set the glowing cylinder carefully on the crate between them. He leaned back, resting his thick, heavy forearms on his knees. "Come eat with me," Emmanuel said, his tone as casual as if he were asking a buddy to share a cheap synthetic ration pack in the mess hall. For 10 long seconds, there was absolutely no movement. Zelia's pride, a monumental force forged over millennia, commanded her to stay perfectly still. Accepting charity from a dirt-covered, primitive primate was a deep humiliation her majestic predecessors would have condemned without hesitation. But the raw, unfiltered radiation pouring from the plasma core was a glorious song of pure life. It hit her starving sensors like a tidal wave of brilliant warmth. Survival, primal and undeniable, finally overrode her majestic stubbornness. Very slowly, with a sharp, grinding noise of fractured joints, Zelia shifted her weight. She leaned forward. She did not touch the core or the man. Instead, she opened her structural nodes. The ambient thermal radiation shifted dramatically, drawn toward her chest in shimmering waves of heat haze. As she inhaled the unseen energy, the sickly gray pallor of her body flared rapidly back into a deep, majestic violet. The jagged fissures running along her arms began to knit together. The crystal, sealing itself with soft, melodic chimes that only Emmanuel's modified implants could hear. They sat there in the lethal cold, two hardened souls sharing a quiet, irradiated dinner at the absolute edge of the world. The transfer of thermal energy did more than merely mend the fractured silicate of her body. As the blinding orange radiation flowed across the freezing gap between them, it actively ionized the thin atmosphere, forging a conductive, shimmering field of quantum interference. Emmanuel leaned heavily forward, his thick elbows resting on his knees, unaware that his deeply modified auditory implants were syncing with the oscillating frequencies of her nourishment. Then, the rigid boundary between human and alien simply evaporated. There was no spoken word, no physical touch. Instead, a sudden, overwhelming rush of pure cognitive resonance slammed right into Emmanuel's mind. It was the breathtaking sensation of falling upward into a vast ocean of structured light. To Zelia, the neural architecture of the human's brain appeared as a chaotic tangle of electrical sparks. Yet the specialized acoustic implants he wore acted as a flawless translation matrix. The burning plasma core served as the anchor. Through its radiant heat, their isolated consciousnesses intertwined in a startling, beautiful synthesis. Emmanuel gasped, his broad shoulders stiffening against the freezing wind. He was suddenly standing inside a grand, invisible cathedral of pure sound, witnessing the surrounding universe directly through Zilia's crystalline senses. He understood, with absolute clarity, that she was never a lost wanderer. She was an instrument of cosmic measure, a living, biological tuning fork, dispatched by her network to gauge the deep, tectonic stability of slumbering worlds. She was here to listen to the planet. In return, Zilia plunged straight into the shadowed depths of the human's memories. She felt the bitter sting of his personal history. She saw the bright, sterile corporate boardrooms where he had once stood, not as a dirt-covered blaster operator, but as a brilliant, senior outer rim geologist. She witnessed him presenting complex seismic data, pointing to intricate holograms that clearly showed erratic, rhythmic anomalies buried deep within the mantle of Aegis 9. She felt his profound, crushing frustration as the wealthy corporate directors laughed at his desperate warnings, arrogantly dismissing his carefully gathered data as simple equipment failure. She experienced the raw humiliation of his unfair demotion, stripped of his hard-earned rank and banished to the lower, freezing tiers of manual labor simply because his undeniable truth threatened their quarterly profit margins. They were two sides of the very same tragic coin, two brilliant outcasts sitting alone in the dark. They were the only two living beings in this entire sector of space who actually listened to the complex song of the deep crust. And both had been discarded by the loud, ignorant masses who surrounded them. A profound empathy blossomed rapidly in the shared space of their connected minds, completely transcending the vast gulfs of biology and culture. "You hear it too," Emmanuel whispered, not with his physical vocal cords, but with his projected thoughts. The mental projection of his voice carried the exhausted weight of a man who had carried a terrible secret for entirely too long. The anomalous tremors, the massive heartbeat hidden in the rock. The corporation insists it is just standard tectonic friction, but my readings were too rhythmic, too deliberate. Zilia's response was not composed of rigid syllables, but of grand harmonic concepts. A sweeping rush of melodic agreement that felt exactly like a deep, mournful cello echoing directly inside his skull. She confirmed his darkest theories. The vibrations were not standard geological shifts. Emmanuel's mind grew grim, a dark cloud forming rapidly in their shared telepathic space. "Then, you need to get off this rock, right now, tomorrow morning, at exactly 0600 hours. The corporation is initiating a mining protocol they proudly call the Great Rift. They are tired of slowly drilling through the thick permafrost. They are going to drop an entire sequence of high-yield seismic charges directly into the planet's primary fault line. They are going to violently blow the entire planetary mantle wide open to extract the deep quantum ore reserves all at once." The reaction from the alien was instantaneous and violently physical. The soothing, majestic violet light, radiating from Zilia's restored crystal body, completely vanished. In a tiny fraction of a second, her entire physical structure shifted to a blinding, terrifying crimson red. The mental bridge between them shuddered violently under the sudden influx of her sheer horror. The psychic harmonic she emitted was so intense that it felt like a brutal physical blow to Emmanuel's frontal lobe, a frantic mental siren signaling absolute planetary doom. Through the temporary mental link, she forcefully pushed a terrifying vision straight into his mind. She bypassed his limited human perceptions and made him truly see the world they were currently sitting upon. Aegis 9 was not a dead ball of ice and rock. The erratic seismic readings, the rhythmic anomalies Emmanuel had discovered years ago, the harmonic frequencies she had come to carefully measure, it all instantly crystallized into one horrifying truth. The world beneath their frozen boots was a colossal, hibernating superorganism. It was an ancient leviathan of the deep cosmos, slumbering peacefully in a frozen stasis for millions of years. The highly sought-after quantum ore was not a mere mineral deposit. It was the dense, energy-rich lifeblood flowing through the creature's immense, subterranean veins. If your people detonate those seismic charges, Zelia projected, her telepathic voice ringing with the desperate clarity of shattering glass. They will not crack a simple planetary mantle. They will pierce a living heart, and the beast will wake up. Emmanuel's breath caught painfully in his throat as the true scale of the impending catastrophe washed over him. The Great Rift was not just an aggressive mining operation. It was a brutal act of unfathomable violence against a sleeping god. And when that ancient god woke, driven completely mad by the sudden agony of explosive charges tearing through its flesh, it would completely obliterate everything on its surface. The mocking miners, the arrogant corporate directors, the heavy industrial machinery, and the massive atmosphere scrubbers would all be instantly eradicated in a single moment of pure biological fury. The temporary bridge of energy began to sharply falter as the plasma core flickered on the crate, its outer edges finally cooling in the toxic air. The shared, terrifying vision slowly receded, leaving the two of them sitting alone in the biting cold once more. But the horrifying truth remained, permanently carved into both of their minds. Tomorrow morning, humanity was going to confidently sign its own death warrant, and only the ruined human geologist and the starving alien tuning fork knew the executioner's true name. Emmanuel did not wait for the morning shift. He breached the central command hub with heavy, desperate strides, dragging the exhausted, glowing alien right past the bewildered security detail. Executive Director Vance sat behind a massive desk of imported synthetic mahogany, swirling an expensive glass of amber liquid. The room was perfectly climate-controlled, a sickening contrast to the frozen hell outside. "Director, you have to halt the Great Rift immediately," Emmanuel roared, slamming his heavy, grease-stained fists onto the polished surface. "The seismic data was completely wrong. My old reports were correct. This planet is not dead. It is a massive biological entity. The explosive payload will not crack a simple rock mantle. It will violently rupture living tissue." Vance sneered, glancing with sheer disgust at Zelia, whose crystalline body pulsed in frantic, warning crimson. "Bull, you are completely out of your mind, and you brought that trespassing, glowing rock right into my sterile office." "Listen to me," Emmanuel pleaded, his voice cracking with an unprecedented terror. "If you drop those charges at 0600 hours, you will kill every single person on this settlement. The planet will wake up." "The only thing dying today is your employment contract," Vance snapped, his face flushing with arrogant rage. He slammed his hand heavily onto a flashing comms button. "Security, restrain this lunatic. Throw him in holding cell block 4. Charge him with corporate sabotage and treason. And get that glowing piece of trash outside our perimeter right now." 4 heavily armed guards grabbed Emmanuel, wrestling him to the ground. 2 others shoved Zelia violently with the butts of their rifles. They kicked the alien out through the primary airlock. She tumbled into the unforgiving snow, landing hard against a jagged ice ridge. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, instantly engaging the electromagnetic shielding. The residual warmth of the outpost vanished in a single, brutal breath. A sudden, vicious planetary blizzard descended from the pitch-black sky, howling with a furious wind that easily reached 120 miles an hour. Cut off entirely from the thermal radiation she desperately needed, her crimson warning light flickered rapidly, dying down to a dim, terrifying gray. The lethal frost began to bite deeply into her newly mended fissures, tearing her crystal matrices apart all over again. Inside the warm command center, Vance checked his heavy gold chronometer. It was barely 3 in the morning. He glared at the red blip of Emmanuel's tracking signal moving toward the holding cells. "To hell with the standard safety checklists," the director barked to his terrified, pale-faced technicians. "Bull might have rigged the primary drilling platforms before he came in here. I want the operation bumped up immediately. Initiate the Great Rift launch sequence right now. Drop the payload." "Sir, we are 3 full hours ahead of schedule," a senior technician stammered, his hands shaking over the glowing console. "The stabilizing anchors are only at 45% capacity. The pressure valves are not ready." "I said drop it!" Vance screamed, spittle flying from his lips. Deep beneath the jagged ice, heavy mechanical clamps violently snapped open. Massive, tungsten-tipped explosive cylinders, each carrying the terrifying destructive yield of 50 megatons, plummeted straight down the primary boreholes. They vanished into the pitch-black depths of the world, dropping miles beneath the frozen crust. The charges detonated. For one terrible, suspended second, absolutely nothing happened. There was no sound. There was no fire. The monitors in the command center simply flatlined. Then, the ground responded. It was not an earthquake. An earthquake possessed a chaotic, jagged rhythm of grinding tectonic plates and shifting rock. This was a pulse, a single, colossal, biological heartbeat that surged upward from the molten core of the planet with unimaginable fury. The shockwave hit the surface with unfathomable force. The heavily reinforced atmospheric domes covering the entire human settlement instantly shattered. Thick panes of transparent steel exploded inward all at once, raining millions of lethal, jagged shards down upon the pristine corporate corridors. Warning sirens shrieked violently into the freezing night, instantly drowned out by a deafening, wet tear that echoed across the entire continent. The ice was literally ripping open. From the newly formed, bleeding chasms in the permafrost, the planet unleashed its ancient wrath. Gigantic, biomechanical tentacles erupted into the screaming wind. They were massive, sinewy limbs composed of dark, bioluminescent muscle and jagged silicate armor, each one wider than a heavy transport cruiser. They thrashed wildly against the blinding snow. The tentacles crashed down upon the billion-dollar steel drilling rigs, wrapping around the massive machines and crushing them exactly like cheap tin cans. Towering industrial cranes were ripped cleanly from their massive anchor bolts and tossed carelessly into the furious blizzard. Thick oil and superheated coolant erupted into the sky, raining down like black blood. The ore miners, the exact same men who had arrogantly laughed by the roaring heater just hours ago, were completely stripped of their bravado. They threw down their heavy tools and ran. They shrieked in absolute, mindless terror as the solid ground beneath their heavy boots turned into a writhing, living nightmare. One of the massive tentacles slammed directly into the primary plasma heater, detonating it in a massive fireball that briefly illuminated the sheer, apocalyptic scale of the monster they had just woken. The human settlement was no longer a highly profitable mining outpost. It was a chaotic, open slaughterhouse. Down in the subterranean darkness of holding cell block 4, the solitary confinement door buckled violently under the immense biological pressure. The emergency red lighting flickered and died, plunging Emmanuel into complete, suffocating blackness. He was thrown violently against the cold steel wall, his teeth biting down hard on his lower lip until he tasted warm copper. He did not panic. His mind immediately locked into a state of hyper-focused survival. He knew exactly what that monstrous thud meant. The arrogant corporate fools had pushed the button early. Emmanuel reached deep into the hidden seam of his heavy insulated boot. During his harsh years as a master blaster, he had learned never to go anywhere without a lethal failsafe. His thick, bleeding fingers extracted a tiny, flat explosive microchip. He pressed the highly adhesive side directly against the electronic locking mechanism of his reinforced cell door. 3, 2, 1. Emmanuel muttered under his breath, turning his face away and covering his head with his thick arms. The microcharge detonated with a sharp, ear-splitting crack. The heavy locking bolts sheared clean off, and the thick steel door fell outward with a heavy, metallic crash. Emmanuel stepped out into the chaotic, flashing corridor. Thick gray smoke poured from the ruptured ceiling vents, and automated warning voices endlessly repeated completely useless evacuation protocols over the busted intercoms. He had to move immediately. The entire facility was going to be dragged down into the biological mantle within mere minutes. But Emmanuel was the former chief geologist. He possessed knowledge the panicked director lacked entirely. He was the only human alive who possessed the exact structural blueprints of the central Terra drill memorized perfectly in his head. He knew precisely where the primary boreholes led, and he knew that the only way to stop this planetary wrath was to dive directly into the gaping mouth of the beast. He broke into a heavy, desperate sprint, his heavy boots pounding fiercely against the vibrating floor grates. He pushed past terrified corporate staff and completely ignored the collapsing support beams. He had to get outside into the storm. He had to find the alien. He had to find Zilia before her light went out completely. Emmanuel smashed through the ruined outer airlock doors, throwing his heavy weight against the buckled steel until it gave way with a deafening screech. He stumbled out into the roaring heart of the blizzard. The wind was a solid wall of kinetic force, screaming at well over 120 miles an hour. The temperature had plummeted to a catastrophic 90 degrees below zero, a level of cold that instantly turned the moisture in his breath into falling ice crystals. He frantically scanned the devastated perimeter. The world was tearing itself apart in every direction, but his eyes searched only for a faint, dim glow. He found her buried beneath a heavy drift of toxic snow, pinned against a shattered section of the perimeter fencing. Zilia was entirely dark. The majestic violet hue was completely gone, replaced by the ashen gray of dead stone. Her crystalline structure was horribly fractured, deep cracks running through her torso like dried riverbeds. She was dying. She had mere minutes left before her consciousness scattered to the void. Emmanuel dropped to his knees, his heavy armored joints slamming hard into the frozen earth. He did not waste time with desperate words. His thick, trembling fingers went straight to the heavy, insulated latches of his own environmental suit. He bypassed the safety warnings, reached deep into his chest plating, and violently ripped out his primary survival thermal battery. The instant the battery disconnected, the interior heaters of his suit completely died. The brutal, agonizing cold of Aegis 9 immediately sank its teeth directly into his flesh. He gritted his teeth as a sharp, agonizing numbness began to spread aggressively from his fingertips straight up his forearms. Ignoring the excruciating pain of sudden frostbite, he jammed the glowing core directly against Zilia's cracked chest. "Take it!" Emmanuel roared over the screaming wind. "Breathe, damn it!" The raw, unfiltered heat surged into her dormant nodes. A faint, desperate flicker of crimson light sparked deep within her chest, slowly expanding outward until it flushed her fractured veins with a bruised, deep purple glow. Her eyes snapped open. As the thermal bridge reconnected their minds, her urgent, telepathic voice flooded his senses. "The creature is in absolute agony," she projected, her mental voice shaking with the sheer magnitude of the planet's pain. "The explosive yields shattered its neural pathways. It will thrash until it destroys its own surface, killing us all. There is only one way to soothe it. I must sing a canceling frequency, a lullaby of resonance, directly into the deepest tear in the mantle where the crust was breached." "The central bore site," Emmanuel projected back, his physical teeth chattering violently. "That is 5 miles directly into the heart of the destruction." He hauled her up, supporting her heavy silicate frame with his rapidly numbing shoulder. Through the blinding snow and falling debris, he spotted exactly what they needed. Sitting abandoned near a collapsing cargo bay was a Goliath-class seismic excavator. It was a terrifying marvel of heavy human engineering, a massive, treaded behemoth boasting titanium armor plating and twin hydraulic crushing claws meant to rip apart solid mountains. The human evacuation was a chaotic, bloody mess. Hundreds of terrified miners were fleeing outward, desperately trying to reach the emergency shuttle pads on the far ridges. Emmanuel and Zilia moved in the exact opposite direction. They waited, against the frantic tide of screaming humanity, hauling themselves up the massive steel treads and climbing into the elevated cockpit of the Goliath. Emmanuel slammed his fists onto the control board, ripping out the ignition panel and manually crossing the heavy ignition cables. The massive dual plasma engines roared to life, shaking the entire cabin with raw, industrial power. He threw the heavy throttle completely forward. The Goliath lurched violently, its massive steel treads chewing through the ice as they drove straight toward the collapsing epicenter of the planet. But the universe, it seemed, was entirely against them. As the excavator bulldozed its way through the ruined settlement, the corporate automated defense grid suddenly sprang to life. Flashing red warning lasers cut through the blizzard. The central computer had flagged Emmanuel as a Level 1 saboteur and identified the Goliath as a stolen asset. 3 heavily armored corporate security drones, looking like flying mechanical spiders, descended rapidly from the dark sky. They opened fire immediately, peppering the heavy titanium windshield with high-yield plasma rounds. At the exact same time, the torn earth directly ahead of them erupted. The superorganism was deploying its biological immune system to fight off the infection of human machinery. Dozens of gargantuan parasites burst forth from the bleeding ice. They were horrifying, slug-like monstrosities the size of armored transports, covered in thick, translucent mucus and lined with thousands of razor-sharp mandibles. They slithered rapidly over the shattered ground, launching themselves directly at the roaring excavator. They were trapped between the cold, calculated precision of corporate artillery and the terrifying, fleshy rage of alien biology. "Hold on!" Emmanuel bellowed, his frostbitten hands gripping the heavy twin steering yokes. He proved exactly why he was the best heavy machinery operator in the entire sector. He threw the massive excavator into a brutal, sliding drift, dodging a lethal barrage of drone fire. He violently swung the right hydraulic claw upward, catching one of the flying security drones in midair and crushing its metal chassis into a spectacular fireball. He spun the heavy cabin around, using the reinforced drilling boom like a massive steel baseball bat to swat a second drone straight into a jagged glacier. But the biological parasites were swarming the treads, their acidic mucus beginning to violently melt through the lower armor plating. They shrieked with a deafening, wet sound, climbing up the sides of the Goliath to breach the cockpit. Zelia stepped forward, leaning heavily against the vibrating dashboard. Drawing heavily on the human survival battery, she extended her hands toward the reinforced glass. She did not use physical force. She sang into the electromagnetic spectrum. A blinding wave of pure violet energy rippled outward from her crystalline hands, forcefully bending the local magnetic field of the planet itself. The invisible pulse hit the swarming parasites like a solid brick wall. The horrific beasts shrieked as their internal navigation systems were completely scrambled, throwing them violently backward into the freezing mud. Together, the human and the alien forged a path of pure defiance, an unstoppable juggernaut of metal and crystal carving its way through the apocalypse. They finally breached the central zone. The sight was absolutely breathtaking and completely terrifying. The Earth had split wide open, forming a colossal, glowing crater that looked exactly like a cosmic umbilicus. Rivers of deep, bioluminescent fluid pulsed violently at the bottom of a 10-mile drop, illuminating the sheer scale of the living tissue they had ruthlessly exposed. "The primary transmission tower," Emmanuel yelled, pointing toward the edge of the massive cliff. "We need to hook you into its broadcasting dish to amplify your song down into the rift." But his heart immediately sank into his stomach. The transmission tower, a towering spire of advanced communications tech, was completely gone. In its place was a massive, writhing knot of dark, biological roots that had surged up from the deep and crushed the steel structure into an unrecognizable ball of twisted scrap metal. The equipment was completely dead. There was absolutely no way to transmit the required frequency. Zelia slumped against the control console, her internal light flickering weakly as the sheer hopelessness of the situation washed over them. The colossal beast beneath them roared again, a sound that threatened to tear the very sky completely apart. Emmanuel stared at the ruined tower, then slowly turned his head to look at the massive, glowing plasma reactor gauge on the dashboard of their excavator. His frostbitten face hardened into a grim, absolute resolution. The only massive energy source left on this continent capable of carrying her acoustic frequency was the engine of the machine they were sitting in. They had to turn the Goliath itself into the largest amplifier the universe had ever seen. He knew what he had to do, and it was absolute suicidal madness. "I have to wire your matrix directly into the main drive," Emmanuel shouted over the deafening roar of the crumbling earth. "The reactor will amplify your frequency by a factor of 10,000, but the feedback loop will be catastrophic. It might shatter your crystal to dust, and it will definitely try to burn me down to ash." Xylia looked at him, her beautiful violet eyes locking onto his exhausted human face. She did not hesitate. "Connect me." Emmanuel tore the heavy plating off the central console, exposing the raw, pulsing conduits of the plasma engine. Below them, the great rift violently expanded. A horrifying apocalyptic sight rose from the 10-mile-deep abyss. It was a colossal, biological maw, easily wide enough to swallow the entire corporate settlement whole. The immense throat glowed with blinding planetary magma, and a heat so intense it began to melt the excavator's tracks, radiated upward. The superorganism was preparing to completely consume the agonizing irritation on its skin. There was no more time. Emmanuel ripped off his heavy, insulated gloves, throwing them to the floor. He grabbed the thick, sparking primary cables with his bare hands. The raw energy instantly blistered his skin. But he did not scream. He slammed the exposed cables directly against the primary nodes on Xylia's back. "Sing," Emmanuel roared, gripping her fractured shoulders with all of his remaining strength. Xylia closed her eyes and sang. She did not use the human spectrum of sound. She unleashed a lullaby of pure, concentrated thermoacoustic resonance. The beautiful, heartbreaking melody slammed directly into the roaring plasma core of the Goliath. Immediately, a lethal surge of runaway radiation fired backward through the cables. It hit Xylia's fragile matrix, threatening to instantly explode her into a million pieces. But Emmanuel was holding her. He planted his heavy boots onto the steel floor and used his own biological body as a massive, flesh and blood-grounding rod. The terrifying excess radiation flowed straight out of the crystal and violently into him. His heavy mining suit began to smoke. The skin on his arms charred and blackened, searing with unimaginable agony. He clenched his jaw until his teeth cracked, refusing to let go, holding the Melody Weaver together with sheer, indomitable human will. The amplified song exploded outward. It was a completely silent shockwave of pure, perfect harmonic resonance. The invisible wave swept violently over the edge of the cliff and plummeted straight down into the molten maw of the planet. It washed across the thrashing biomechanical tentacles and rippled outward across the entire frozen surface of Aegis 9. It was a song of deep sorrow, a profound apology, and a desperate plea for peace, fueled by the agonizing sacrifice of a single human being. The monstrous, glowing mouth abruptly halted its upward ascent. The deafening, apocalyptic roar of the tearing earth stopped. The planet was listening. Then, the most miraculous thing happened. The superorganism did not merely sink back into a resentful slumber. It resonated back. The melody had proven that the tiny creatures on its surface were not merely mindless, destructive parasites. The profound harmony forged between Emmanuel and Xylia had touched the ancient Leviathan soul. From the bleeding, shattered edges of the Great Rift, the planet began to heal itself. Massive, breathtaking pillars of brilliant violet crystal erupted smoothly from the deep permafrost. They shot upward into the howling storm, not as weapons, but as structural supports. The towering spires caught the collapsing steel frameworks of the mining settlement, holding the ruined domes aloft with effortless grace. The violent tectonic shaking faded entirely, replaced by a deep, soothing hum that vibrated through the air. These newly formed crystal pillars began to pulse with a warm, golden light. They were freely radiating endless, clean thermal energy, a pure gift from the slumbering god below. It was enough raw, perfect power to permanently solve the energy crisis of the entire human sector, completely eliminating the need for destructive quantum drilling ever again. The blizzard died down, leaving a sky filled with the soft, ethereal glow of the planetary crystals. The surviving miners slowly crawled out from beneath the wreckage. They gathered at the edge of the settlement, their faces painted in the beautiful violet light. They looked out toward the massive rift, and then they looked at Zelia. There was no laughter, there were no cruel jokes. There was only absolute, stunned reverence. Sitting precariously on the precipice of the glowing crater was the ruined, smoking hull of the Goliath excavator. Beside it, dangling their legs over the edge of the world, sat the massive, heavily scorched human and the radiant alien girl. Emmanuel was breathing heavily, his arms wrapped in makeshift bandages torn from his ruined suit. He looked utterly exhausted, but a rare, genuine smile rested on his scarred face. From his scorched utility belt, he pulled out one last, small, thermal battery core. He snapped the casing with his thumb and held the glowing, orange cylinder out toward her. Zelia leaned in, her crystalline body now glowing with perfect, flawless health. Together, they shared the meal, sitting in the glorious, magnificent silence of a world reborn. Thank you so much, dear listeners, for staying with us until the very end of this incredible journey. We would love to know where you are listening to this story from. So please let us know in the comments below if you found today's story beautiful and engaging. Please consider helping us out with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment. Your generous support is the only way we can pay our dedicated staff, helping them feed their families and allowing us to keep creating even more amazing stories for you to enjoy. Thank you again, and we will see you in the next adventure.